Hi everyone, and welcome to the third session in our Financial Services Spring Series. Many thanks for joining us today. I'll just give everyone just a quick minute to get themselves into the room, and then we will kick off in earnest. But just as a quick introduction, if you've been to these sessions before, you already know, but just in case, these are intended to be short introductions to financial services regulatory topics for compliance professionals, lawyers, and anyone who'd like to learn a bit more about financial services. So before we start, a few pieces of housekeeping to go through as always. I'd be grateful if you could keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation. And we may not have time for questions, but our contact details will be on the final slide. So please do get in touch with us if there's anything you would like to discuss. And we will be recording today's session, will be distributed in due course. So your speakers today will be myself, Lorna Stephen, a senior solicitor in the Financial Services Regulatory team, and I will take you through a brief history of ESG and greenwashing. Next, my colleague James Harrison, a trainee solicitor in our team, will tell you about what the FCA has done so far in relation to regulating sustainable investment. And Sylvia Matheson, a solicitor, will then look forward to see what's coming down the track in this space. Just before we kind of really get into the meat of the presentation, it's important to remember that ESG is a very broad term and can be used in many different ways. In this presentation, we'll be focusing very much on the environmental aspect with particular reference to sustainable investment. So before we look at what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the future, it's helpful to look back and see where ESG and sustainable investment has come from. ESG might seem like a modern concept, but it's actually been around for centuries. I have a quote in my notes from John Leslie, an English cleric and part of the Methodist movement of the Church of England, and you'll see his picture on the far left of our timeline. There are businesses which might be innocent in themselves, but which at this time require cheating, lying, or other customs which are contrary to good conscience to provide an adequate income. These two we should avoid. The quote's taken from a sermon he gave in the 18th century, which spoke about responsible investment and avoiding investments which may have provided a good return but were immoral, and it's an early example of investing with conscience. So you can see I've put the 1700s religious groups on the left-hand side of our slide here. I've already mentioned John Wesley and the Methodists, but they were followed by the Quakers, who began investing in the stock market in the US and UK and provided socially responsible guidelines. They avoided companies who manufactured or traded in alcohol, gambling, or weapons. Later on, Charles Jacob, the investment manager for the Methodist Church, would go on to propose the first ethical fund in the UK in factories in the UK, built upon the premise of better conditions for workers in the 18th centuries. So then we jump forward quite a way, I would have to say, into the 60s and up to the 80s, where anti-apartheid investing developed. In 1962, the UN established the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. Disinvestment from South Africa gained critical mass in the 80s as a result of televised coverage of riots and suppression, particularly as students demanded that their universities disinvest. So in 1992, we can move on, and the United Nations held its conference on environment and development, known as the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. 179 nations were represented at the summit, which was an effort to focus on the impact of human socioeconomic activities on the environment. The output of the summit was the Rio Declaration, which consisted of 27 principles intended to guide countries in future sustainable development, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So in 1998, and you'll see on the slide, the UK launched the world's first corporate governance code, initiated by the Cadbury Report from 1992 and the Greenbury Report from 1995, with both sets of recommendations consolidated into the UK Corporate Governance Code and enshrined into UK company law. Then we move a bit further forward into 2000, when amendments were made to the 1995 UK Pension Act. This required pension funds to provide a statement of investment principles, which had to include the extent to which social, environmental, or ethical considerations are taken into account in the selection, retention, and realization of investments. And in 2004, we saw the first documented use of the phrase ESG in the Who Cares Wins report, which was the output of an initiative by the UN Secretary General and UN Global Compact in 2004. in their report, Recommendations by the Financial Industry to Better Integrate Environmental, Social and Governance Issues in Analysis, Asset Management and Securities Brokerage. And then, it's not on the slide, but in 2007, we saw the first 82 companies become certified B corporations. This now stands at 4,088 companies globally, spanning 77 countries and 153 industries. In 2015, Paris Agreement was negotiated by 196 parties at the UN Climate Change Conference, which opened for signature on Earth Day 2016 and came into force on the 4th of November 2016. Its most high-profile aim was to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. Also in 2015, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was established by the Financial Stability Board, an international body that monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system. Its aim is to help identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to assess climate-related risks and opportunities. The TCFD published their recommendations to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures in 2017, which identified climate change as one of the most significant risks that organizations face today. And now we're going to go right bang up to date. And in 2021, so just towards the end of last year, the UK government published Greening Finance, a roadmap to sustainable investing, which outlines regulatory changes in the UK to encourage consumers and investors to make more environmentally positive investment decisions. Specifically, it looks at sustainability disclosure requirements, the UK Green Taxonomy, both of which we'll touch on later. And as I'm sure you're all aware, in 2021, Glasgow hosted the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26. The result of the conference was Glasgow Climate Pact, negotiated through consensus of the representatives of the 197 attending parties. The pact was the first climate deal to explicitly commit to reducing the use of coal and included wording that encouraged more urgent greenhouse gas emissions cuts. So now we've kind of gone from the 1700s all the way up to the end of 2021. I want to turn your attention to what seems like a more modern concept, which would appear to follow on from the end of my timeline, greenwashing. Greenwashing has been all over the media in recent years, both Boohoo and Deliveroo being accused of greenwashing practices. However, it's not as modern an idea as you might think. It's broadly accepted that greenwashing was first coined by prominent environmentalist Jay Westerveld in a 1986 essay, in which he claimed that the hotel industry was falsely promoting the reuse of towels as part of a broader environmental strategy, when it was actually just a cost-saving measure. But what is greenwashing, and why is it an issue? Greenwashing, or sometimes it's referred to as green sheen, is the process of a business making claims about its products or services, or hiding or omitting information to give the impression that they are less harmful or more beneficial to the environment than they really are. So the important thing to think about is that greenwashing isn't just about positive statements made by a company. It can include situations where companies fail to disclose information about parts of their business or services which are less environmentally friendly. Why is this an issue? The main issue with greenwashing is that companies can say they're making a positive impact through their marketing, whilst also practically contributing to climate change. It may also erode consumer confidence that any green marketing claims are true, even ones made by legitimate companies, as a result of suspicion created by those who are providing misleading information about their green activities. It also relies on the fact that consumers may not have the information to be able to compare two products or services' green credentials on a like-for-like basis. Consumers are reliant on information that the companies themselves publish, which, even if there's no greenwashing going on, there may be bias towards the message the company is looking to project. Standardized reporting requirements and taxonomies, which we'll touch on later, can go some way to addressing this, but these are very much still in their infancy, and it will take some time before we're able to make true like-for-like comparisons. So before we move on to what the FCA is doing in this space, I'd like to highlight the Competition and Market Authority's Green Claims Code, which was published in September last year. This is obviously broader than financial services and relates to any products or services marketed as green, but it sets out some helpful principles in relation to greenwashing and statements made about products and services. The code was published as part of a wider awareness campaign the CMA launched ahead of COP26. The code gave businesses until the end of 2021 before the CMA was to carry out a full review of misleading green claims, both online and offline, from the start of this year. The code focuses on 6 principles, which are based on existing consumer law. These are that claims must be truthful and accurate. So claims must not mislead consumers by giving them inaccurate impression, even if those claims are factually correct. The CMA specifically calls out the example of coffee cups, which state that they're compostable, but are unsuitable for home composting and require industrial composting to recycle. Claims must also be clear and unambiguous. So they should be straightforward and presented in a way that consumers can easily understand them. This can capture things like labeling a product recyclable, but not providing any further information as to how it may be recycled and whether it needs to be broken down to do so. Claims must also not omit or hide important relevant information and that consumers need in order to make an informed decision. And comparisons must be fair and meaningful. So they must be based on clear, up-to-date and objective information. Claims must also consider the full life cycle of the product or service. So you're not allowed to just focus on one aspect where, yes, you could claim it's green when the overall product or service itself wouldn't be considered. And then the last principle I've got here is that the claims must be substantiated by evidence, and businesses must hold that evidence to support their claims that they're making. So where the CMA finds that firms have breached any of these principles following the review, which is being carried out at the moment, it intends to take action against offending firms, and particularly where there's clear evidence of breach of consumer law. So now I've taken you from 1700s to present day in little over 10 minutes, and introduce you to the more and less modern concept of greenwashing. I'll hand you over to James to talk about what the FCA has done so far in relation to sustainable investment.
Thanks, Lorna. Good morning, everyone. I'm James Harrison, a trainee with the Financial Services Regulatory Team, and I'll talk us through some of the steps that the FCA have already taken in relation to ESG. First, I'll talk through the 2021 Dear AFM Letter that sets out standards and shortcomings for authorised fund managers in relation to ESG marketed funds. I'll then move on to talk about the ESG 21.4 discussion paper before wrapping up by discussing the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, and the reporting requirements firms are currently subject to. So first, the Dear AFM Letter. In July 2019, the FCA published a letter addressed to authorised fund managers. The letter expressed concern at the high value consumers were placing on funds marketed with an ESG label and wanted to set out their expectations for managing these funds, along with perceived shortcomings noted in the related fund applications. Although this letter brings up these issues in the context of funds with an explicit ESG focus, we can still glean a useful insight into the FCA's approach to ESG regulation more generally. It would be useful to gain an early familiarity with the FCA's approach, given their intent to expand a new ESG classification and disclosure regime across financial services over the next 3 years and beyond. The FCA notes in their letter that ESG and sustainable investment funds comprise the fastest growing EU funds market, and that they receive a high number of applications to open these types of funds. The main concern of the FCA is maintaining the trust of the consumer, given that a well-functioning and appropriate ESG fund market is critical to achieving the net zero economy. If trust is lost due to mislabeling, consumers may avoid investing in this market, which erodes competition, opposing one of the FCA's primary objectives. Another key point raised is the March 2021 remit letter received from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which allows the FCA to have regard to the government's goal of achieving net zero by 2050 when making their other decisions. The FCA illustrates their concerns by setting out stylized examples of common application issues. They proceed to lay down guiding principles for managers making ESG marketing claims related to funds. We are provided with an overarching principle and 3 particular principles, each with underlying key considerations. In brief, the overarching principle is consistency, and the 3 particular principles are in turn: 1, the design of responsible or sustainable investment funds and disclosure of key design elements in fund documentation. This means that consumers should understand and be able to choose between different forms of sustainable fund strategy. 2 is the delivery of ESG investment funds and ongoing monitoring of holdings. So resources should be provided to support the delivery of stated sustainability goals, and data should be provided to consumers on whether the fund's holdings align with these goals. And third, pre-contractual and ongoing periodic disclosures on responsible or sustainable investment funds should be easily available to consumers and contain information that helps them make investment decisions. And for each of these principles, key underlying considerations can be found in the letter that illustrate their application in practice. The Dear AFM letter sets out the approach of the FCA in particular circumstances, but also sets the stage for the wider discussion paper that I will turn to discuss next. So this brings us on to the DP 2014 ESG discussion paper, for which consultation closed on 7th of January this year. Those consultation responses will inform the development of policy proposals which were initially intended for Q2 this year. It seems likely the FCA has found itself occupied with previously unforeseen events, but we expect the release of this policy paper remains high on the list of the FCA's priorities. The DP 2014 discussion paper references the Dear AFM letter and continues its themes of transparency and trust, key commitments found in the FCA's strategy for positive change. Two initiatives put forward by the Chancellor will require the FCA's involvement to implement, being the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements, or SDRs, and the introduction of sustainable investment labels. So the SDR regime will apply to real economy companies, including listed issuers, asset managers, and owner firms, and is designed to implement existing disclosure rules developed by the TCFD. The SDRs relate to the upcoming UK Green Taxonomy, will be informed by the ISSB standard, and form part of a workstream involving the International Organization of Securities Commission, or IOSCO. Several regulators are involved in developing and implementing the SDRs and have replicated this FCA-provided diagram, which set things out as clearly as they can be, given the number of overlapping initiatives. Many UK firms operate within the EU and are already subject to the EU Sustainability Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR. The FCA intends to develop the new domestic SDR regime in a complementary manner to this existing SFDR regime, and are separately considering what requirements will apply to third country funds marketing in the UK. Further to the SDRs, the FCA proposes a sustainability labelling regime, given that labels strongly guide consumer behaviour. A five-way split is suggested in the format shown on the slide. As you can see, there are three categories of sustainable investment, transitioning, aligned, and impact, with two further categories of responsible and not promoted as sustainable. Policy proposals are not yet definite, but the FCA suggests a potential three-tier system of disclosure, depending on the audience. The first tier would consist of the product label. The second tier is consumer-facing, being key product-level info, and the third tier contains detailed disclosures at product and entity level, along with sustainability risks, opportunities, and impacts. This third tier is useful for institutional investors and other stakeholders. So, we've covered the Dear AFM letter, which set out the common issues of ESG fund promotion, and have now examined the intended regime for disclosures and product labelling slated for introduction over the next year. Finally, we can discuss the steps already implemented by the FCA to ensure ESG standards, or the TCFD reporting regime. As Lorna mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, made recommendations in their 2017 final report. Recommended were climate-related disclosures under four key areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The comply or explain model applies in this case, meaning if disclosures are not included within the TCFD report required by the regime, a reason must be given as to why. The government goal is for TCFD disclosures to be mandatory across the economy by 2025. Using policy statement 20/17, the FCA brought in new listing rules for premium listed companies which applied the recommendations. The next step was policy statement 21/23, which created an equivalent listing rule for issuers of standard listed shares, being equity shares or any other type of share, and standard listed issuers of GDRs representing equity shares. There were further considerations in this policy statement for standard listed debt and debt-like securities. A further policy statement, 21/24, extends the TCFD reporting requirements to 34 asset managers and 12 asset owner firms as of 1st of January this year. When PS 21/24 comes fully into effect by 1st of January 2023, it will bring 140 asset management firms and 34 asset ownership firms with £12.1 trillion in assets into scope of the reporting requirements. Further details of that scope can be found within the policy statement papers. Complicating matters, the TCFD released guidance in 2021 relating to the implementation of their 2017 recommendations. The previously mentioned PS 21/23 and PS 21/24 both integrate this updated guidance into the disclosure rules. So the new guidance informed rules apply to TCFD disclosures for an accounting period beginning on or after 1st of January 2022. As a result, they will not apply to the disclosures made in 2022 for premium listed companies' current accounting period, although these companies may choose to volunteer this information sooner than required. To summarize what we've covered in this section, an understanding of the TCFD disclosure regime will be required for companies no matter your practice, given the goal of the government to extend these disclosure requirements across the economy. For those working more directly with ESG products, especially if these involve funds labeled with sustainability themes, keep an eye out for the upcoming SDR and sustainability labeling regimes. If you're looking for a head start as to what these regimes might look like, turn to the discussion paper 2124. I'll now pass over to Sylvia to discuss the likely direction of the FCA moving into the future.
Thanks, James. So we can certainly see there's been some progress made by the FCA in terms of meeting its ESG commitments, but how far is still to go? So in November 2021, the FCA published its ESG strategy, which James has touched upon. And that strategy sets out target outcomes and actions required to deliver those outcomes with the aim of supporting the financial sector and driving change. And that includes the transition to a net zero economy. Underpinning the strategy were 5 core themes: transparency, trust, tools, transition, and team. As part of the strategy, the FCA committed to looking closely at how technology, innovation, and a data-led approach can be harnessed to support the integration of ESG, both across markets and in the FCA's regulation. The FCA's focus on ESG has been evolving over a number of years, and in April this year, the Chancellor issued a letter which said that the FCA should have regard when it comes to supporting the government's strategy and the important role that the financial system will play, referring back to an earlier 2021 letter, which said that the FCA should have regard to the government's commitment to achieve a net zero economy by 2050. And the Chancellor did welcome the work already done by the FCA to date, referring specifically to the TCFD rules and sustainability disclosure requirements. But this recent reminder suggests the government is expecting even more from the FCA. Also in April 2022, the FCA published its 3-year strategy and this year's business plan, outlining the key work it is committing to over the next 12 months. And some of you on the call may well have tuned in to hear our webinar on the FCA's 3-year strategy and business plan, which we delivered a couple of weeks ago, and that should soon be made available to you online. And we were not surprised to see ESG feature in both the strategy and the business plan. As part of its focus area of setting and testing higher standards, the FCA is looking to achieve trust and consumer protection from misleading marketing and disclosures around ESG-related products, high quality climate and wider sustainability-related disclosures to support accurate market pricing, which will assist consumers and investors to choose sustainable investments and drive fair value. Also, active investor stewardship that positively influences companies' sustainability strategies, supporting a market-led transition to a more sustainable future. And the FCA intends to measure its progress for its ESG commitments by developing metrics to measure the incidence of misleading marketing where ESG products are concerned, and metrics to measure the increase in the quality and quantity of climate-related and sustainability disclosures. The FCA intends to collaborate with industry leaders and other regulators to develop indicators for the effectiveness of stewardship. The FCA is also committed to embedding ESG issues and how it authorises firms. It will also build on the regulatory framework by setting ESG-related rules and standards. The business plan has committed to empowering consumers and firms to help ensure consumers get relevant, targeted key information on the ESG products and services available to them, and making available to consumers the information they need to make informed choices about the ESG credentials of the firms they interact with. Also in this year's business plan, the FCA committed to working more with the Fintech community to enable innovation through dedicated facilities, such as its Sandbox, which builds on the tech sprint, and its recent Green Fintech Challenge. These are 3 new initiatives introduced by the FCA as part of a programme of work to assist firms and regulators to overcome some of the challenges in moving to a sustainable net zero economy. So looking first at the Sustainability Tech Sprint, this was held in October last year with the aim of developing solutions to overcome challenges faced by regulators in monitoring ESG data and disclosures, such as how to verify the accuracy of disclosures and how technology can help build a robust, reliable and accurate sustainable investment label. which will in turn enable consumers to better understand their choices and compare the ESG credentials of different products and providers. And the FCA also announced that it would run a second phase of its digital sandbox, which focused on firms developing tools around ESG data and disclosure. In September last year, applications opened for businesses wanting to test and develop new products with a view to accelerating innovation around specific market challenges, such as defining ESG criteria and greenwashing, which Lorna had covered earlier. The purpose of the Digital Sandbox Sustainability Cohort is to seek to address challenges such as how technology can enable transparency and disclosure and reporting, especially on the characteristics of corporate assets and their supply chains, as well as how technology can be used to automate the assurance of an issuer's ESG data and validation of its ESG labelled corporate bonds. Another challenge to be addressed is how technology can assist consumers in understanding the ESG characteristics of the products and providers they engage with, as well as provide visibility around alternatives aligned with their needs and preferences. So 12 organisations have been participating in the cohort and working in the sandbox from November 2021 to March 2022. What happens next will depend on the success. Potential outcomes for participating firms could include partnering with a financial institution to further develop their solution, or testing in the FCA regulatory sandbox or other existing services. So turning now to the FCA's Green Fintech Challenge. In March, the FCA announced the 10 firms that have been accepted into the Green Fintech Challenge to continue developing innovative products and services that will aid the transition to a net zero economy. Following a successful pilot, a second Green Fintech Challenge was launched as part of the FCA's campaign to drive innovation in the sector. The winners are able to benefit from the FCA's Innovate services, granting them access to the sandbox, to direct support, and to the advice unit. It's a way to test and develop ESG-friendly products and services in a safe space with the full backing of the FCA. And there's some really exciting products which have been accepted, including one by Tread, which is building a UK green neobank. Their first product is a green debit card that plants trees as you spend and lets consumers track, reduce and offset their carbon footprint. Another interesting product is one being developed by Green Growth Investments. It's a mobile app that allows consumers to make green investments in the form of exchange-traded funds. Consumers can set their risk appetite and select their preferred green initiatives, which relate to the funds they invest in. So some really interesting products that have been accepted into the Green Fintech Challenge and well worth a look on the FCA website when you have some time. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and I've just got a couple of minutes, that's coming down the track is the development of the UK's Green Taxonomy, which will be based on the EU Taxonomy. And the Green Taxonomy will set out universal criteria which specific economic activities must meet to be considered environmentally sustainable or taxonomy aligned. The objective is that the taxonomy will form part of a firm's sustainable disclosure requirements, which James has already helpfully discussed. And it's expected that the UK's green taxonomy will reflect the 6 environmental objectives provided under the EU taxonomy, namely climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and lastly, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So effectively, it will provide businesses and investors with a common language to classify their sustainable activities. And legislative proposals for the UK Green Taxonomy are expected at the end of 2022. So I won't keep you for much longer. That brings us to the end of our canter through ESG. So we started in the 1700s, we finished in 2022, and no doubt there'll be more for us to talk about in future financial services regulatory series, as interest and engagement in ESG remains a hot topic for firms and consumers. So thanks so much for joining us today. Next week will be our final session in this series, so please join us then. We will be discussing the Quince Care Duty, how its scope has extended and how that applies to authorised push payments and cases of fraud. So we look forward to seeing you then.